Sure. Then could you hit that word "got it" for me behind you, if you don't mind, to try to figure out how to work that Macintosh mouse? Hello, everyone. It is February 7th, which means next week is Valentine's Day, which is the poorly timed Ash Wednesday, so we won't meet next week. So we should eat chocolate. So next week, some of you will start fasting something too. Be thinking about that. That's why we start advertising for Ash Wednesday, because some of the people come to the Ash Wednesday service like, oh, it just snuck up on me, and I don't know when I'm going to fast. So we are in our Disciple Fast Track New Testament Study Manual on page 24, chapter 3. If you're following along on YouTube, we did John last week, and we're going back in time to do Luke this week. So after Ash Wednesday, we can do Acts, because I'm going to set up Acts with our last parable tonight in this lesson, because I think Luke's has an agenda, as each of our gospel writers had an agenda. They have a function of the gospel, and so each one is different, and Luke has a perspective and a function that's different than the others. And so we are going to be taking tonight our vote for the greatest gospel. It is award season, and we need to make sure we have crown a champion at the end of the night. And I don't know, the recency bias of Luke may pull out the love of John, or the first placeness of Matthew. Should be great. I'm gonna be honest. Mark usually doesn't get a lot of votes. So we're gonna go to our human condition on page 24. Gosh, I really thought that the Bible teaching was strong this week. And we'll do the mark of discipleship on page 31. Mark of discipleship, I won't do the little italicized version on page 30. I think the best mark of discipleship is the final paragraph on page 31. Just a really strong paragraph. Okay, the human condition. You may have bristled against this. It might not be your current human condition, but I think it's the human condition. I said at the beginning, some of these are going to really resonate with you. And this one you may say, that's not me. And if it's not you, God has done a good work in your life. But I want you to recognize that it could be a human condition or the human condition, especially for those who come from a privileged background. And so I've had people say, I crossed that one out. That doesn't apply to me. And I was like, well, good, but I think it applies to a lot of people. And so we'll respond with one of the best mark of discipleships that we get. So our human condition on page 24 for chapter 3, about the Gospel of Luke. The key word is least, and the chapter title is God Seeks the Least, the Last, and the Lost. And the human condition says this: I really don't like the poor. They're not always clean. I stay away from sick people. They smell bad. I don't understand people whose customs, culture, and ways of thinking are different from mine. They make me feel uncomfortable. I don't want to go to church with them or socialize with them. People with disabilities also make me feel awkward. Actually, I enjoy being with people who are just like me. Oof, a hard one to read. And it's responded with the mark of discipleship with this. Last paragraph on page 31. Deep down, disciples know that their wealth, power, and prestige will not save them. Deep down, disciples know they're desperately in need of Jesus Christ's grace. Deep down, disciples understand that God has a special concern to include the outcast, the marginalized, the widow, the orphan, the dispossessed, and the exploited. Disciples throw their weight with God's mission to the least, the last, and the lost. Maybe one of the hardest human conditions to read, and maybe one of the joyous marks of discipleship. Luke is an incredible work, and I can't wait to look at it tonight. And this function is going to be particular to our mission and the response to the human condition. And so we're going to be juxtaposing a little bit of Luke with Matthew, Sermon on the Plain versus Sermon on the Mount. We're going to spend some time looking at kind of the core sort of intricacies of what's happening. And we need and we get to start with the function that you see right at the beginning. So I'm going to read those first 3 verses because Luke just comes out with the function right away, just like John did last week, saying, hey, God, this is written so that you might believe. we get an insight into things before we even get started. So I've backtracked. I said I was going to start with 4, then 3, then 2, now 1, and now 1, 1. Okay, we'll see how far we get. Since many have undertaken to set down an orderly account of the events that have been fulfilled among us, just as they were handed on to us by those for whom the beginning were eyewitnesses and servants of the word, I too decided, after investigating everything carefully from the very first, to write an orderly account for you, so that you may know the truth concerning the things about which you have been instructed. So Luke is going to be, from what we understand, probably a little bit more educated, probably a little bit more well off than some of his other friends who are writing on this, potentially from this source document. Again, the synoptic gospels are going to be Matthew, Mark, and Luke, and they're going to be similarly placed within some stories. And there's going to be some differences we're going to talk about. But he just comes right out and says, my function is going to kind of investigate what happened and write it for you so you can kind of know the base stories behind this. And there's going to be some things that are particular to Luke that we don't find elsewhere. One of those is the very famous Magnificat found in Luke 1, starting in 46, or Mary's song, Mary's prayer. And it's going to set a tone for the whole book, just like last week in John 1:1 in the prologue. It gave us a lens by which to read the whole document, light and life, and these kind of juxtaposing just these major themes. Same thing. Mary's song is going to be very particular, and it's very political. And so it starts with this significant word that God is going to be Jesus Christ, the image of God, Yahweh in the flesh, is going to have some significant, something to do with the people of the world, those who are mighty and those who are lowly. And so just right off, you have in verse 48, the Spirit of the Lord looking on the lowliness of his servant Mary, and then the mighty one doing great things. And if you go to verse 52, you have words like this. He has brought down the powerful from their thrones, lifted up the lowly. He has filled the hungry with good things and sent the rich away empty. And so you've got some very interesting language that sort of begin to set us up for what we're to expect in the Gospel of Luke. So if you go to Jesus, the beginning of Jesus' ministry in Luke 4, what you're going to see is Jesus unrolling this scroll in the temple and declaring kind of, my ministry has begun. And it begins like this in chapter 4, verse 18. The Spirit of the Lord is upon me because he has anointed me to bring good news to the poor. He has sent me to proclaim release to the captives and recovery of sight to the blind, to let the oppressed go free, and to proclaim the year of the Lord's favor. And so what you have right away is this early kind of preferential love for those on the margins in the heart of Mary and in the ministry of Jesus. And as you go along with some of the story, if you look to, I believe it's going to be Luke 7, there's going to be some words too that you're going to find about, are you kind of really the Messiah that we're looking for? And chapter 7, if you go down to verse 22, you've got Jesus answering this question, are you the Messiah? Are you really this chosen one? In Luke 7:22, you have this. Jesus answered them, go and tell John what you have seen and heard. The blind receive their sight, the lame walk, the lepers are cleansed, the deaf hear, the dead are raised, the poor have good news brought to them, and blessed is anyone who takes offense at me. So those are some early indicators of kind of what we're going to be finding in the Gospel of Luke. But I think a couple of the bigger tells are going to be the Beatitudes found in Luke 6 on the Sermon on the Plain, which are going to be drastically different from the Beatitudes are going to be found in Matthew 5 on the Sermon on the Mount. And I want to take a little bit of a moment to kind of just show you the difference between those two and how different Luke is than Matthew. And as we think about that, saying that they're both right. And as we mentioned, I think 3 weeks ago, everyone hears a sermon differently. And based upon their likes, their dislikes, their history, their story, their preferences. If you have John Middendorf preach a sermon, and you are predisposed to care for those on the margins because of what God's done in your heart, and you have someone who is predisposed to care for something different, Doug Forsberg's going to hear a sermon differently than someone who's not Doug Forsberg. And Doug Forsberg's going to hear through the sermon, you got to care for those on the margins. You got to care for those who are in prison. You got to care for those who are outcasts. But someone maybe without Doug's heart or experiences or life, they may hear the same sermon and say, God wants me to do this. God cares about this. Isn't it so interesting that we bring so much to every document. We bring so much to every sermon, and you hear things differently. So I think that Matthew was right, and I think Luke was right, and their memories of them are dependent upon their memory, their story, and then the function of why they wrote the sermon and the gospel in their own particular way. So I don't think that one's wrong and one's right. I think they're both right. I think it's just from different human perspectives. So, but listen to the drastic difference. I'm going to start with Luke because that's where we're at. Then I'm going to read the beatitude that we find in Matthew. So in Luke 6, verse 20, that's when we get our Sermon on the Plain. And we have the words, blessed are you who are poor, for yours is the kingdom of heaven. That's Luke. Matthew 5, blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Boy, that is a drastically different thing. Even more, verse 21 in Luke of chapter 6. Blessed are you who are hungry now, for you will be filled. If you go to verse 6 in Matthew 5 of the Beatitudes, you have the words, blessed are those who hunger and thirst for righteousness, for they will be filled. If you've been hungry before, or know someone who's been hungry, being hungry is different than hungering and thirsting for righteousness. We had just a little as a commentary on the side of the room. Blessed are you who weep now. And you just have the idea that it's pretty drastic. That one's not as different as blessed are those who mourn, but it is interesting for those who weep now. And so when you go to Luke, there's just this idea that the Yahweh who is going to be throughout the Old Testament, always on the side of the widow, the orphan, the sojourner. The message that we had throughout all the Old Testament is that you've been loved, so go love everybody. And then what's embodied throughout, I really think, the Deuteronomistic history, a lot of the embodiment of that 10 commandment of like, hey guys, I took care of you when you were enslaved, so take care of those who are slaves. I took care of you when you were on the margins and when you were the sojourner. Now your job is to take care of the people on the margins, take care of the sojourner. That is embodied so deeply rooted in the works of Luke, as Luke is trying to find ways to say, this is who Jesus is, which I think each of the gospel writers are doing. And I'm just convinced that they're all right, and they're all giving us the fullness of that picture. It's like a globe that when you see one side of a globe, you can't see how big the other side is. I saw a globe the other day, and one side of the globe was all ocean. Have you seen a globe recently? I don't know. I don't have kids' school or where I was, but it was just like, I was like, do you mean to tell me that almost a fourth of our whole world is ocean? Just but this one ocean. This one ocean. You know what I'm talking about? It's just like, I was like, what in the world? Yeah, 3/4 ocean, but like that one ocean was like a third of the globe. And I was like, whoa. So if you saw somebody and gave them a picture of like, this is the earth, and you showed them a globe and like you just showed them that ocean part, like they'd be like, that's not the picture of the globe that I have in my mind, right? Like, so in the same way, what we haven't got so far is this preferential love for the poor of the heart of God that is seen in Jesus yet until we get to Luke. And the picture we have of Jesus from the Gospels is incomplete without Luke. And so also what we have amazingly is like the niceties of Matthew, who's writing to kind of make sure to bring along his Jewish friends, right? To like follow after Jesus and like, hey, this Jesus is that God, right? Like in the Sermon on the Plain, as soon as we get these blessedness, you've got the heart of Mary right afterwards in verse 24. It's like, woe to you who are rich. You've received your consolation. Woe to you who are full now. You will be hungry. And then we're just like, whoa, 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 whoa. And you can see like maybe the Pharisees who were very privileged, who were trying to capture the spirit of Jesus in Matthew, maybe would not have listened to the heart of Mary and the Sermon on the Plain and been able to really understand if you've got, woe to you who are laughing now, for you will mourn and weep. Woe to you who all when I'll speak well of you. And you're just like, whoa. Because again, right after, you've got these words. But I say to you that listen, love your enemies and do good to those that hate you. So we have some of the same heartbeat in the message of the Sermon on the Mount in Matthew 5, following the Beatitudes, in the Sermon on the Plain, but they're drastically different. And I resonate with that because sometimes John will say things and I'm like, I want to listen to some of that sermon, but not all of it. Does that make sense? I got one good laugh out of that. Where you're just like, I like everything you said except for that love your enemies part. Like I'm gonna just like, I like everything you said about that, but then that last part I'm gonna just. Does that make sense? But also there's distraction and there's the function of the gospel, and you see time and again, that gospel writers have a function and a viewpoint and an audience that is allowing them to write in a particular way. And this is the way that we get most of all in the Gospel of Luke. And so I think that I'm going to have us go ahead and go to my very favorite parable, which you guys know that the Good Samaritan is my favorite parable. I've already preached this once on October 18th, apparently according to my class. But we learned back on October 18th when we were looking at the history of Deuteronomy and the Ten Commandments that good rules were tied to good stories. And we said that Jesus followed after that when he gets to, in both Matthew and Luke, this Good Samaritan story. They become a story to understand the rule that's happening. And I want to read this because there's something I believe in Luke 10 and in Luke 15 that there's just, to me, I may skip Luke 15, but we'll see how much time we have for. But there's some stories that are told in Luke that are going to help us understand Acts in a particular way that I think is really going to matter to us. And so I think that's what we're going to get to. I think we'll see where we go. But I'm going to read a little bit of this parable. I know I've already read it in class, but it's just too much for us to not see what he's trying to accomplish, I think, in this story. And so if you go to Luke 10, verse 25, you have the story of the Good Samaritan. I think I want to read it because I would know we've read it already once. You probably read it this week if you were following along reading, but I just think that when you have a story like this, it's too powerful to just skip over and say, you probably remember this story. It's okay to read a little bit. So I'm going to read a little bit for us. Verse 25. Just then a lawyer stood up to test Jesus. Teacher, he said, what must I do to inherit eternal life? And I'm going to stop already because my friend Steve Green said when I was teaching class, he's asking the wrong question. You can't do anything to inherit eternal life. Nothing at all. So he's asking the wrong question. And Jesus knows that. He said to him, what is written in the law? What do you read there? And he answered, you shall love, Shema. You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, and with all your strength, and with all your mind, and your neighbor as yourself. And he said, you've given the right answer. Do this and you will live. And one of the great lines of all Scripture. But wanting to justify himself, which actually is tied to that first, what must I do? Says this, and who is my neighbor? Okay, I'm going to set this up just a little bit before I read, because you need to know what's going to happen in Acts, and you need to know what's going to happen kind of historically. So the Samaritans are those people from the north, and there is a north and a south prejudice and bigotry and hatred I think it was in our Bible teaching this week when we had sort of the idea of someone who was a true Jew, kind of almost spitting in their mouth, just kind of just this gag reflex when it came to someone who was mixed race, mixed religion, not true Jewish, not following after, kind of just those people, as othered as you can get. We talked a little bit about the potential racism of Jesus with the Syrophoenician woman a little bit. I'm not going to talk about that too much because this is going to go on YouTube, but I don't want to get canceled from some of my people who don't like what if I might call Jesus a racist, including my daughter Berkeley, who would hate when I would say that. But you've got a real distrust, hatred, and so we need to know in our hearts the kind of gag reflex that a Samaritan would give a Jew. And so Jesus replied, a man was going down to Jerusalem from Jericho, and he fell into the hands of robbers who stripped him, beat him, and went away, leaving him half dead. Verse 31. Now by chance a priest, I love that line. Now by chance a priest was going down that road, and when he saw him, he passed by on the other side. So likewise a Levite, when he came to the place and saw him, passed by on the other side. But a Samaritan, while traveling, came near him. And when he saw him, he was moved with pity. He went to him and bandaged his wounds, having poured oil and wine on them. Then he put him on his own animal, brought him to an inn, and took care of him. The next day he took out 2 denarii, gave them to the innkeeper, and said, take care of him, and when I come back, I will repay you whatever more you spend. Then he asked this question. Which of these 3 do you think was a neighbor to the man who fell in the hands of the robbers? Our affluent lawyer Jew says, the one who showed him mercy. Jesus said to him, go and do likewise. Can you see that our good, rich Jewish friend could not even say the word, the Samaritan? He just can't even gutturally come to grips with the idea that you've made the hero the wrong character. The hero in the story is never going to be a Samaritan, never going to be one of those people. And Luke, at the core, is going to find ways to allow these Gentile sinners, these Samaritan outcasts, to be seen as lifted up as the hero of the story. And I'm convinced that we're able to understand Acts because of what Luke does to set us up to realize that the gospel is not going to be just for Jews. The gospel is going to be even for Samaritans, even for Gentiles. And there's something that just allows us in these stories to find ways to allow us to see the wrong character being led to have us understand as the hero. Now, I'm going to add another story to that, another parable in Luke 15. I can't get away from it. Then we're going to talk about race for a little bit. Then we're going to pray. Then we're going to have a vote. So, in Luke 15, you've got perhaps another set of the more famous parables, the lost sheep, the lost coin, and the prodigal son. The prodigal son is probably, the Good Samaritan's my favorite parable. The lost son's probably 1A, 1B. It was the text of the favorite sermon I've ever preached in my life. For some of you who have seen that before and watched that, I dressed up in 3 characters. I dressed up as a young hip person and preached a sermon. And then we had a couple of songs. We had a song, and in the song I went back and changed into a tuxedo and came out as the elder brother and preached a sermon. And then I went back and I stripped out of my tuxedo and threw upon an old person's outfit with a cardigan and a rocking chair and put gray in my hair and came out and I preached the last bit of the sermon as a grandfather. And it's probably my favorite sermon I've ever preached because I've had it in my head. I've always wanted to do that. And John let me. He was like, you should preach this. And I was like, are you sure? He was like, yeah, that sounds like something you are passionate about. I know us. And so it's very memorable to me It's all from the heartbeat of a, a, a book of The Return of the Prodigal Son by Henry Nouwen. And he writes that book from the perspective of when you read this parable, you can experience it at different points of your life from different characters. And so there's moments in which you can see yourself as a loving father. There's moments you can see yourself as a lost son, and there's moments you can envision yourself as an elder brother. And whatever you're reading it as now, you may read different another later time. And so it's a multi-layered book. I strongly recommend it. It's called The Return of the Prodigal Son by Henry Nouwen. I might have an extra copy in my office if you want it tonight. That's one of my top 5 books I've probably given away in my life. It's Nouwen writes, it's like 120 pages. Like, that's one reason I like Nouwen. Like, it's short and sweet. I'm not having to read 250 pages and trudge through it. It's like all inspiration. And so I love this parable, and I love the message. And yet, as I read it through the lens of Luke, I think he's doing something just beyond finding ourselves as a lost son, as a loving father, as an elder brother. I think he's speaking to us in what's going to happen with Acts. Because again, you have a person who's writing from a different function than we have in Matthew. And I think in some ways, there's a globalness to this as well as there's a macro and a micro. And I love the multifaceted function of a parable like this, because I really do think that when you read this from the lens of what we read it so far, especially with the last parable we looked at, there's something about the elder brother being the Jews who are going to kind of potentially have the ability in Acts and beyond to look at these Gentile newcomers and saying, what do you mean? What do you mean that they get to be included in this thing too? But Acts is going to show that the gospel is not just for good Jews. The gospel is for everyone, which again goes back to our very first thing in week 2 in Genesis 12, 1-3, that the whole thesis was there. We could have stopped week 2 in our whole thing with the thesis of the gospel. Yes, God loves you, so go love, yes, everybody, right? Again, we're here. Look how many pages we've gone through. Look, and we're still saying the same thing, but in a new way. So I don't think I want to take the time after 29 minutes of our recording already to read this parable again. But there's some key lines I may want to bring out. So in the parable of the prodigal son in Luke 15, verse 11 is where it's going to start. You're going to have a man with 2 sons. And this lost son, this prodigal son, is going to go to the point where he's feeding pigs. Now, for those of you who know a little bit about Jewishness, the idea that you would not even eat the food that was given to pigs would just be like a comedy of errors when it comes to just how disgusting and gross that prodigal son would be. Meanwhile, the elder brother's done everything right. And yet, what does God have a vision and passion for? And I think that, you guys, the lines that in verse 20, when the prodigal son was still far off, his father, look at the action verbs, saw him, filled with compassion, ran, put his arms around him, and kissed him. Just loved him. Our face towards tonight was about this. I know I'm loved, right? Like, this is the vision of love, right? And it's like, yes, everyone's going to say, amazing grace, how sweet the sound that saved a wretch like me. I once was lost, but now was found, right? Like, everyone's going to be happy about this, right? And yet you've got the elder brother who's always done everything right. And the elder brother just, verse 28, becomes angry and refuses to go in. Maybe you're hearing hints of Jonah in this, right? There's just this idea. What about me? There's hints even when we come back with our first week together, when we have the story of Cain and Abel, right? Like, am I my brother's keeper? Like, there's just like, and again, we said the thesis could be, yes, of course, that's the whole message. Again, week 1, the whole thing, you are your brother's keeper. Yes, you are. Like, and so you've got these 2 brothers, and they're, to me, when we get to Acts and the epistles, I want us to have a empathy for the elder brother in the story, because what we're going to have in Acts is we're going to have some stories that are just going to just boggle the minds of good Jews who are wanting to follow after Jesus. And you're going to have some really interesting compromises. I'm convinced the compromises in Acts do not make sense if first we don't read Luke and figure out the Samaritan's the hero, the elder brother is outside the bounds of wanting to make sure that we are allowing in our whole family now people who are different than us. And so when we get to Acts, a little bit of a spoiler alert, the Jews are going to have to learn to open up their hearts to a whole nother group of people who they hate, dislike, and find wrong and abnormal and outcast and misfits and the wrong race and the wrong gender and the wrong religion. And God's resurrection is going to change the whole system of following after Yahweh. And so Luke's function is to be like, yeah, I got to lay the groundwork. Because if Luke were to follow after Matthew, if Acts were to follow after Matthew, we might not really have, unless I don't know much of your family ancient histories, but most of us are not from the lineage of our Jewish friends. We wouldn't be here if there was not in Luke, I'm convinced Luke is the gospel that allows Acts to happen in ways that actually can make sense. Because there are going to be some good Jews who say, well, they can be part of our family of faith, but they need to get circumcised. This is the spoiler alert. There's going to be a part of Acts that's like, well, what we meant was a circumcision of the heart. And you're going to have some Jews who are just like, no, that's not what it meant. And let me show you right here. It is not saying circumcision of the heart. I mean, it's just like this, like it meant a circumcision, the real deal, and has meant for, 4,000 years. Like this is like, we're all of a sudden just going to be like, no, it was meant of the heart. Like can you imagine one guy like Peter has a dream, right? And all of a sudden you're just like, yeah, that let's include them all, right? Like, hey, that prodigal son with the pigs, come on in, be part of the family. It'll be fine. Just like, what in the world? Like so when you think about those Jews who for thousands of years and hundreds of generations knew we are following the precepts and laws that have set out to us in, I'm so bad at pronouncing this word, perpetuity. What were you going to say? Okay. I might be thinking the same word as you are. Like, this is going to be forever, right? And what changes it? Just one thing. God has come in the form of Jesus, and he has shown us the way. And we did not like it. And so we killed him. And God raises Jesus from the dead and says, nah, this is the way that it will be. Love will always win. And so let's go change the world and really love everybody. So the closing moment of this before we vote and talk is this. About 4 years ago, I read a book called The Cross and the Lynching Tree. And for the first time, and help me, I'm blanking on the name of the author. So embarrassed. Can someone Google it for me? Because I want the people online to make sure that they know. Not John the Apostle. I'm going to wait. Sorry. Just a little bit of a Jeopardy moment. The Cross and the Lynching Tree by James Cone. Yes, African-American theologian. And I just finished a novel this last week. I always try to read a novel by a Black author when February turns the calendar for Black History Month. And it was called Shout in the Fire. And was it an amazing novel to read. So about 4 years ago, I read James Cone, and I just couldn't put it down. It's one of those books the last 10 years It's like one of the top 10 books I've read. And I just had to shake my head over and over again. And I wanted to talk a little bit about race tonight because I feel like I went through all of my college education and master's degree, and nobody took time to say, hey, Jason, let's talk about being a pastor in America with the history of slavery and the experience of the Black body when it comes to church and in America. And I devoured that book by James Cone because I think it may have been the first real book by a Black author from America that I had read. And I just looked at, I've missed whole segments theologically. And The Cross on the Lynching Tree talked about how Jesus's body was strung up on a tree, and the Black body in America has been strung up and lynched because of the white dominant voice of American churches that have perpetuated the hurt and racism against the Black body in America. And I thought, as I finished the novel, can I really teach another disciple and not mention this? I didn't think I've taught disciple 11 times in 10 years, and this is my 12th time through. And I don't think one time I stopped to say, hey, this is another part of what it means to be Christian in America and to be a white pastor. And I want to ask forgiveness for those who may watch this in years who've gone through 10 years of disciple, and I've never stopped to say, hey, that parable that we had about the Good Samaritan with the North and the South and the hatred that the true Jews in the South had for those people in the North, it just cut to my core this week as I was finishing this novel. I was like, I can't not stop and say something. I could say, oh, I do the Martin Luther King Jr. thing every Matthew. I think that's pretty important on MLK Jr. Day weekend. I think that line is really important. But I didn't delve into race there, never have. And when Cone, in I think chapter 3 of that book, talks about Jesus strung up on a tree versus those who were strung up on a tree and lynched in the South. I was like, whoa, I had saw it for the first time and I was like, oh my God. And I'm beginning to, I think, learn more about race and whiteness and Blackness in America, and I'm probably far behind the curve of where I could be. But I just thought I should stop this week and say, I see how I have taught a Bible study class for 10 years and never been like, hey, there's a problem. The predominant white church has not been helpful to its African American brothers and sisters over the last 300 years when it came to church in America. And I could probably be like, well, we're not necessarily talking about church in America, or we're not talking about me, or, does that make sense? But like, I think trying to explain it away just does more harm. So I wanted to name it and ask forgiveness for it, and just to be like, I wanted to present it as, whew. And this week when I was reading for the first time, and I think I'm slow to catch new themes. It was the gift of a novel, right? Sometimes I think I'm reading more novels rather than theology books as I get older, and man, I think I learn more through those good stories than I do sometimes reading the theology book. I most times choose ones that I already agree with. I like that guy. I agree with everything he said. So the novel this week just pierced me. I mean, that kind of that chest in your heart kind of constricted a little bit. We're just like, wow, that's me. When you're just kind of exposed through a novel sometimes. And then when I read The Samaritan, and I said to myself, those people in the North were judged by the people in the South who thought they were the true Jews, who didn't trust those in the North and kind of spit out of their mouth because they were the Samaritans. And I just said, oh my God, it's the white church. No, way we treated the Black body. I say that James Cone uses that language of Black body just because he's trying to know that the church is objectified and othered in ways that not recognizing the whole personhood of those who are different than. And again, when we're looking at Luke, different than is going to be the thesis of the whole story. And so when I read the North and the South, I never in my own head, I don't know, I'm sure that's in good black theologians that I haven't read yet. I'm sure that's somewhere, but like I just saw for the first time this, this 3/5 line, right, between the North and the South. I just saw it for the first time. I was like, whoa, it's even the South and the North, and the prejudice for those in the South for those in the North. And it caught me off guard this week, and I just said, I said, I got to say something about it in Disciple. I got to get out a recording. I want my kids, if they're going to watch this when they're 40, to be like, what does Dad believe about the Bible? Could you really go through that many seasons of teaching the Bible, put it on YouTube, and never mention this? Yeah, I did. I did that for many years. For 10 years, I didn't mention this when teaching the Bible. And so there's many perspectives that I think I miss. I think I miss some of the outcast misfits because I'm not a woman or a black person or a disabled person. Does that make sense? I come from a rich white man in power teaching in this chair, holding court and conversation every time I'm in this room. And so I think that perhaps if my friend Britt were to teach this, perhaps she would teach it differently, right? If my friend Sean were in this chair, or Richie, or Matthew, I think that does that make sense? So in the same way, I'm saying this confession to also say, I hope the Disciple is here's how Jason sees it, but I want you to read along with me to see how you see it, and why we were trying to have more conversation in New Testament to be able to be like, what are your perspectives? Because I think that's what I've enjoyed probably most so far. So when the camera goes off, and we're like, well, how did you hear that? And I'm like, oh, I didn't hear that perspective, or I didn't read that. Does that make sense? So I think that I'm getting perhaps closer to learning myself. I think I'll actually remember this lesson for Disciple this year more than any other, because it's the lesson where I've been like, how could I do it? How could I do it for 10 years and miss my friends who, if they were in this seat, could not have taught a Bible study lesson for a whole year and not brought up what it's like to be a woman, what it's like to be disabled, what it's like to be black. Does that make sense? So thank you for hearing and receiving and hearing my offer of apology and asking for forgiveness. And thank you for hearing me. But I want, if McCall and Berkeley watch this someday to figure out what Jason believed about the Bible, what Dad believed about the Bible, or my grandkids someday, I hope they get to this lesson. Because I think that when 2 generations from now look back at this guy, I think they may say, how could he? Because I look back 2 generations ago and I think, how could they? Does that make sense? Right? Like, how could they? And there will be some things that I don't even know what they are. I mean, I don't know. How could you, kids and grandkids, put your kid in a Christian school? How could you live in a one single dwelling house without other people you bringing into them? How could you eat meat? I don't know what they are, right? Like, and I've got things now that I do now that some of you are like, how could you watch 200 NFL football games every year? I mean, like, there are things that I do that don't make sense to people, but I think generationally, right, there are things that I'm doing right now that they will look back and say, did Dad really think he was a Christian and he? Right. Does that make sense? And we can't name those things right now because we can't see them. We're blind to them. I'm going to shut this off. I'm not going to shut off I'm not going to shut you off, Jamie and Brenda, but I am going to shut the recording off so we can really talk about what you've heard, and then we'll have our vote. Thank you for listening.